The day I handed in my resignation letter, my mother laughed. Not a polite laugh, not an uncomfortable laugh, a real, full laugh, the kind she saved for genuinely funny things, like when my brother tripped at his grade school graduation or when the neighbor's cat got stuck in the fence. She laughed like I had just told the best joke she'd heard in years. "You're quitting a stable government job," she said, still catching her breath, "to buy a rundown animal shelter that's been condemned by the city." My father didn't even look up from his crossword. I drove home that night, with the resignation letter folded in my jacket pocket and the purchase agreement sitting in a manila envelope on the passenger seat. 31 years old, 12 years working as a municipal permits coordinator for the city of Edmonton, and I had just signed away my entire RRSP, $43,000, on a derelict property on the east side of the city that hadn't passed a safety inspection since 2019. Everyone I knew thought I had lost my mind. Maybe I had, but I also knew something none of them did. I should back up. I had worked in the permits office long enough to know which properties in the city were quietly sitting on gold. Not literal gold, I'm not talking about treasure maps. I mean the kind of value that only becomes visible when you know how to read zoning amendments, infrastructure expansion proposals, and the city's 10-year capital plan. Most people don't read those documents. They're dense, they're boring, and they get buried in the public consultation section of the city's website where nobody ever clicks. I read every single one. In February, I came across a proposed LRT extension that would run directly through the Northeast Corridor, which meant a new station, which meant foot traffic, which meant the surrounding blocks would be rezoned from light industrial to mixed commercial residential within 5 years, 7 at the outside. The property I had my eye on, an abandoned animal rescue facility on 82nd Street that had shut down during the pandemic, sat exactly 4 blocks from the proposed station site. The current owner, an elderly man who'd run the shelter for 20 years before his health gave out, was asking $68,000. The building itself was a write-off, but the land, just over half an acre in a corridor about to explode in value, was worth sitting on. "I made an offer," he countered. "We settled at $59,000 with a 30-day closing. My RRSP covered 43. I borrowed 11 from my line of credit and scraped the remaining 5 from a GIC I'd been letting sit untouched for 6 years. When the transfer cleared, I had exactly $412 in my checking account. $412, a condemned building, and a piece of land that most people thought was worthless. My younger brother, the one my parents spent their lives bragging about, the one with the MBA from Queens in the corner office at a downtown consulting firm, called me the Sunday after closing. "I heard what you did," he said before I'd even said hello. "Word travels fast. Mom's worried about you, we all are." He didn't sound worried, he sounded entertained. "You withdrew your entire retirement savings. I made an investment. You bought a condemned animal shelter. I bought land." There was a pause. Then, "You know Dad thinks you need to see someone, right? Like professionally." I hung up. My mother called the following Tuesday, which was unusual because she typically reserved calls for Sundays and emergencies. She spent the first 10 minutes asking whether I was eating properly, which is her way of establishing maternal authority before delivering an actual opinion. And then she said, very carefully, that she and my father had been talking, and they were concerned that I might be having some kind of episode. "An episode," I repeated. "You've always been sensitive," she said, "since you were small, and after the breakup with Mum. I made a calculated financial decision based on information I gathered professionally over 12 years. I'm not having an episode. You quit your pension. I quit a job. The pension vested at 10 years. I kept the pension." She went quiet for a moment. "You could have talked to us first. Would it have changed anything?" She didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. "I want to be fair here. My family isn't cruel. They're not villains. They are people who grew up believing that safety was the highest virtue, that a government job with benefits and a defined contribution plan was the ceiling worth aiming for, and anything beyond that was recklessness dressed up as ambition. My father spent 34 years at the same insurance company. My mother taught elementary school for 27. They retired within 6 months of each other and now spend winters in a condo in Palm Springs, and summers complaining about the drive to Palm Springs. They built a good, solid, careful life. I just didn't want that life. The problem was that I couldn't say that without it sounding like an attack on theirs. So mostly I stopped trying to explain. The building itself was worse than I expected, which is saying something because I had walked through it twice before signing. The roof over the east wing had partially collapsed sometime in the winter. The property manager hadn't mentioned that, or maybe he hadn't noticed, or maybe he'd decided 68-9 was still a reasonable price for a half-clufted building on a rezoning corridor. I wasn't going to argue, I was in. I couldn't afford to rebuild. What I could afford was to stabilize the structure enough to pass a basic occupancy inspection, which meant hiring a contractor who owed me a favor. My former supervisor's nephew, a guy named Preston, who did renos on the side and was willing to work weekends for cash. We ripped out the worst of the damaged drywall, patched the roof, replaced the breaker panel, and got the water running again. It took 6 weekends and cost me just under $8,000, which I put on my credit card and tried not to think about at night. By April, I had a building that was technically habitable. By May, I had rented the front portion to a mobile grooming company that was looking for a fixed address for their business registration, and the back to a woman who ran a small dog training operation out of her car and had been desperate for indoor space. Neither lease was glamorous. Combined, they brought in $2,200 a month, but they covered my credit card minimum payments and kept the lights on. I was not by any definition doing well, but I was not drowning either. My brother came by in June. He didn't call ahead. I was in the back section of the building repainting the wall that had been water-stained, still in work clothes, when I heard the front door. He appeared in the doorway looking like he'd taken a wrong turn into a neighborhood he hadn't expected to be in. He was wearing a blazer on a Saturday. He surveyed the space with the expression of someone trying to calculate how much the demo would cost. "It's smaller than I thought," he said. "It's bigger than it looks from the street." He picked his way around the tarps on the floor. He didn't offer to help. He looked at the freshly patched ceiling, the industrial pendant lights I'd installed myself, the painted concrete floor. He looked the way people look at something when they're deciding whether to say what they actually think. "I talked to a commercial realtor," he said. "Friend of mine from Queens. He says you overpaid. He hasn't seen the LRT proposal. That proposal has been sitting in public consultation for 2 years. They push it back every budget cycle. This cycle it was approved. That stopped him." "What?" "Council approved the Northeast extension in March. Capital commitment confirmed in the Q1 infrastructure report. It's buried on page 47. He blinked. "And you think that changes the value of this place?" "I know it does. So does every developer who's been quietly buying up the corridor for the past 8 months. I got in before the announcement hit the news." He was quiet for a moment. I went back to painting. "How long are you planning to sit on it?" "As long as I need to. And if the city delays again, or cancels?" "You're stuck with a dog grooming studio in a condemned building. It passed inspection last month. And the city isn't canceling. I've seen the contractor bids." Another silence. I could feel him trying to find the angle where he was still right. "I just don't understand why you couldn't do this with money you could afford to lose," he said finally. I set down my paint roller. Because I didn't have money I could afford to lose. I had one opportunity and one shot at it. That's how it works when you're not starting with someone else's down payment. He flinched at that. He hadn't expected it. Neither had I, honestly. He left 20 minutes later. We didn't fight. He just ran out of things to say. My parents came by in August. My mother brought a casserole, which she does when she's trying to make peace without saying sorry. My father walked the property and said nothing, which is his version of the same thing. We sat in the front office. The grooming company had set up a little waiting area with chairs and a fake plant, and ate the casserole out of containers because I didn't have a proper table yet. "It's cleaner than I expected," my mother said. "High praise," I said. She looked at me steadily. "I just want to know you have a plan." "I have a plan. And if it doesn't work, then I'll have a different plan." My father cleared his throat. "The building smells like dogs. It used to be a shelter, still does a bit. I'm working on it." He nodded slowly. "Then, the structure looks solid. Whoever did the roof did it properly." It was the closest thing to a compliment I was going to get, and I knew it. I thanked him. We finished the casserole. They drove home. The thing about the LRT announcement, once it finally went public in September, was that it didn't trickle out, it detonated. Within 2 weeks of the official press release, I had received 4 unsolicited emails from commercial real estate developers asking whether I'd consider selling. One letter arrived by courier which felt almost old-fashioned. I didn't respond to any of them. By October, the offers were coming through a broker. The first formal offer was $420,000 for the land and building as is. I declined. The second was $510,000 with a 90-day closing. I declined again. My brother called. Someone told me you've had offers, he said. A few, and you're turning them down. I am. Can I ask why? Because I'm not done yet. Done with what? You've made a 900% return in 8 months. What are you waiting for? I thought about how to explain it. About the rezoning amendment I'd filed for mixed-use commercial that would allow a 4-story build on the property. About the heritage designation application I had quietly submitted for the original shelter facade, which, if approved, would make the property significantly more attractive to developers who needed heritage credits for their builds. About the fact that 3 of the 4 developers who'd approached me were also competing for a municipal grant for community and core developments, and I was in quiet conversation with one of them about a ground-floor animal services component that would satisfy the grant criteria. I'm maximizing, I said. He went quiet. You planned all this. Some of it I figured out as I went. Why didn't you tell us? I thought about my mother laughing, my father and his crossword, my brother and his queen's friend who said I overpaid. Would you have believed me? He didn't answer. The heritage application was approved in November, faster than I'd expected, because the original shelter had been built in 1947, and the brick facade was genuinely notable. The developer I'd been speaking with, a mid-sized firm that had been operating in Edmonton for 20 years, and knew exactly what the heritage credit meant for their portfolio, came back with a new offer in December, $780,000, with a leaseback provision that would allow the animal services tenant to remain in the ground floor for a minimum of 5 years. I hired a real estate lawyer. Her name was Josephine, and she had been recommended to me by a woman in my building who had used her for a commercial dispute and said she was the kind of person who read every line and then read it again. Josephine did read every line. She also flagged 2 clauses in the leaseback agreement that would have significantly disadvantaged me in the event of an early termination and negotiated them out in a single phone call. We closed in February. After Josephine's fees, the real estate commission, the capital gains tax, and the outstanding balance on my credit card and line of credit, I walked away with just over $560,000. I want to say that number felt unreal, but it didn't. It felt exactly like what it was: 12 years of reading documents that nobody else wanted to read, $412 in a checking account, and a roof patched on 6 consecutive Saturdays with someone who owed me a favor. It felt like the exact right size for what it had cost. I called my parents on a Wednesday evening. My mother answered on the second ring. I sold the property, I said. Oh, a pause. How did it go? It went well. How well? Well enough that I'm thinking about what to do next. Another pause, then my father's voice in the background asking who it was. My mother said my name, and then after a moment she came back on the line. Your father wants to know if you're coming for dinner Sunday. I'll be there. Good. A beat. Bring something for dessert. You know he likes the butter tarts from that place on White. She didn't say she was proud of me. She didn't say she was sorry, but she asked me to come for dinner and she knew which bakery I'd go to without needing to explain, and that was its own kind of language that I'd been speaking with her my whole life. My brother texted later that night, just 3 words, okay, I see. I put my phone down and stood at the window of my apartment, the apartment I could now afford to leave if I wanted to, and looked out at the city that had, block by block and page by page, quietly taught me everything I needed to know. I was already reading the next proposal.